Hey everybody, welcome back to 7th Level Sound. Thanks for joining in, and I hope you're all ready to get nerdy once again. So today I want to spend a little bit of time talking about one of the most powerful EQ tools that's available out there today. You're going to find it in pretty much every studio around the world, regardless of location or price point. It's a sound that everybody should be familiar with, and guaranteed that pretty much everybody has heard it at least once or twice in their life, regardless of whether they're aware of it or not. And it has to be, pound for pound and dollar for dollar, one of the most effective ways that you can shape the tone of your source as you're recording it. So, what am I talking about? Talking about this, right here. When it comes to audio engineering, knowledge of microphones and their usage is sitting right there at that crucial juncture between the art and the science, and is one of the most important things that every engineer needs to learn when developing their skill set. Obviously, there is a ton to be said about how to place microphones in relation to the source and how to dial them in correctly with the other elements of your signal chain. There are a ton of videos out there on the internet about these exact techniques, and the number of ways that you can go about it is about as variable as the number of engineers that are out there in the world. Today, I'm not so interested in talking about the basics of microphone placement and dialing them in with the other elements in your signal chain. Instead, what I want to focus on and spend a little bit of time exploring is the choices of microphones and how selecting the right microphone with the right frequency response can be used to very powerfully shape the tone of the sound that you're capturing. Most people have seen an SM57 before. This is one of, if not the most popular microphones in existence. It's been used on countless amounts of records over the years. It is probably one of the most instantly recognizable sounds when it comes to capturing sources like drums and guitars and other acoustic instruments. They're relatively inexpensive. You can find them just about everywhere, and the amount of power that this little thing has over the shaping of your tone really can't be overstated, I think. Just because this is one of the most popular and widely used microphones in existence may not necessarily mean that it's always going to be the right choice for the source that you're trying to record. Obviously, all dynamic microphones have their own natural frequency response curve. There's also a lot that can be said about the science and the engineering that goes into tuning a microphone to have a specific frequency response, between the construction of the microphone, the type of capsule, the type of magnet that's attached to the capsule, and all that. So what I want to explore in this video is how much effect we can find when comparing this microphone to a few other options, and see if maybe the SM57 isn't necessarily always the best choice. Now, one of the most common uses for dynamic microphones like the SM57 is for capturing percussion elements like drums, and in particular, the snare drum is probably the most commonly captured with a dynamic microphone like a 57. So what I want to do today is compare this microphone here with 5 other dynamic microphones of relatively equal size and price range to shoot out against our SM57 here today. This is the SHURE SM57 Beta. We have the AUDIX i5, have a MIKTEK PM10, we have an AUDIO-TECHNICA ATM21, and AKG D40. We got the studio drum kit set up over in the live room. I got a very generous drummer friend over here who's going to spend a bit of time doing some demonstrations on just some snare playing with all of these microphones. We'll put them up head to head to see exactly how much difference each microphone makes when capturing the snare drum sound, and we can do a little deep diving exploration into all the variables of the various elements and things. But first, I think we'll start off with just some playthrough examples, spend a few minutes, just let the drummer jam out, play around, and you'll be able to hear how all the different microphones affect the tone of the snare drum as he's playing. Like I said, this is going to be a pretty nerdy video, so hope you're all up for it, hope you enjoy, and we'll be back here in a minute to really dive in. But now, let's hear some drums. Okay, so that's our first little introduction into the sound of all these microphones. What do you guys think? Maybe not so much difference between them all? Or maybe just a little bit hard to tell when in a full mix with 6 or 7 other microphones combined together. So I think now let's maybe dive in a little bit deeper and start exploring some of these microphones on their own head-to-head. Let's start off with the SM57. Obviously, this is a sound that everybody should know. It's probably the most common snare microphone in existence. So let's just have a little listen to the SM57 on its own right here. Yeah, so that's the sound of an SM57. It's very dry, very present, doesn't exactly have a ton of depth or warmth in the low end. This is actually probably one of my biggest complaints about the SM57. If we pull up the frequency response chart for it here, as you might be able to see, it has quite a big bump, somewhere right around the 5 to 6 kilohertz range here. Fairly flat through most of the mid-range until you end up with this little bit of a dip down between, say, 150 to 500 hertz. Another bit of a bump again around 120 to 150, and then a real steep fall off just above 100 hertz there, going down into the bass range. This is one of the things that actually makes the SM57 so versatile and easy to use in pretty much every application. The fact that the low end is going to be very controlled, and you automatically get that big lift in the presence areas. But I find, especially with the way that the low mids and the lows are kind of shaped on the SM57, can make it sound a little bit boring. Maybe you don't quite get some of that same oomph that you would want out of the source. Depending on what your snare drum sounds like, maybe it starts cutting off some of the frequencies that you still want to have to drive your snare a little bit harder. So this is exactly what I'm talking about with the way that microphone frequency responses very drastically will shape your sound on the way in. I suppose I should mention as well, we are running all of these microphones through the exact same preamp, my Warm TB12 Tone Beast. This is pretty much my go-to preamp whenever I have an SM57 or an SM57-like microphone out, particularly because I can use the amount of saturation and the shaping that it has with the different op amps and output transformers to kind of take a microphone like the 57 that's a little bit papery, has a little bit of spike in the high end, and use a bit of saturation to kind of smooth things out a little bit and bring up a little bit more excitement in the body. So 57s, I have a bunch. I use them all the time. Sometimes they're exactly what I want. Sometimes they're just not doing it for me, and that's why the rest of these microphones are here. Speaking of, I think our next microphone up that we'll have a look at would be the 57 Beta, this guy right here. This is a more modern interpretation of that classic design. The 57 Beta is usually my first choice when I decide that the 57 is just not quite giving me what I want. Particularly because so one of the things that I actually quite like about the Beta 57, if you have a look here, where on your typical 57 you got a big lift right around 5K here, on the Beta it sits a little bit lower, maybe kind of towards more 3 to 4K, dives off a little bit, maybe just above 5, like 5.6, and then has another big lift again, significantly higher, 7, 8 to 10K kind of thing. This immediately makes the 57 Beta sound a lot more, to me, hi-fi. It's a little bit more excited in the 1 to 2 kilohertz range, which can sometimes make sources sound a little bit honky, but if you have a source that's a little bit on the dull side or maybe isn't quite as exciting as what you would want, then being able to push those frequencies a little bit harder kind of helps bring that element forward in your mix and saves you from having to do a whole bunch of extra EQ pushing and notching and things in post. And I think that's probably the most crucial ideas to take away from this video, is that when you're choosing your microphone to be able to tailor its frequency response to what you want out of your source, you're going to be getting something closer to your final product. So just being able to change a microphone out and get your source closer to what you want it to sound like in the final mix down saves you from having to stack up a ton of plugins, potentially introducing things like phase distortions and all kinds of other less than desirable digital artifacts. If we look at the mid-range again, you can see the proximity effect is pretty accentuated. The closer you get, the more of a bump you're going to get, somewhere between 150 to 250 hertz. And especially on something like a snare drum, around 180 to 220 hertz range is going to be right where the fundamental tone of your snare is going to be sitting. So depending on how close you put the mic to the snare, you're really going to be able to accentuate that fundamental tone and really drive a little bit of extra oomph into your snare sound. And as well, you can see, while the roll-off through the lower mid-range, the upper bass, and into the bass register is definitely prominent, it's a little bit more gentle than what you got on your SM57. This is definitely one of my favorite snare microphones here. I use it on guitar recording all the time as well. If the 57's just not cutting it, this is going to be probably the first microphone I reach for. All right, so let's have a little listen to the 57 Beta. Yeah, so already you can hear there's a little bit more going on in the low end there. Because of the way that it shapes the lower mid-range, you get a little bit more of that sort of ringy first harmonic overtone of the snare, so maybe that would be something that I would want to go in with an EQ after the fact and try to just pull out a little bit of that first harmonic there, just to help the actual fundamental of the drum sit forward a little bit more. The other thing to listen for, the other main difference, is that the Beta 57, while the SM57 itself is your typical cardioid polar pattern, the Beta 57 is a super cardioid, so your pickup pattern is going to be a little bit narrower in front of the microphone capsule, which definitely helps you reject things on a busy drum kit. Placing your microphone so that it's going to be able to reject a lot of the elements around it, whether they're toms, cymbals, hi-hat, stuff like that. Having that tighter polar pattern in front of the capsule makes things a lot easier, so you don't have to be quite so dead on with your mic angle, especially if you're trying to angle it away from the hi-hat to reject all that extra bleed that comes through. But of course, with a supercardioid or hypercardioid pattern, the mic does pick up a little bit more directly 180 degrees behind the direction of the capsule. So if you point your mic directly away from the hi-hat, you actually might get a little bit more bleed than turning it maybe like 30 degrees off axis from that 180 degree reverse there. Speaking of things that shape your signal, when it comes to the most extreme and exaggerated frequency responses out of all these mics, this guy here, the AUDIX i5, definitely goes farther than all of the rest of them. Let's pull up the frequency response chart, and immediately you can see it is incredibly hyped compared to the other microphones that we've looked at so far. You've got a massive bump between 100 to say 250 hertz here, even extending as far down as maybe 60 to 75 hertz, and then a huge lift again right around 5K, but with a fairly gentle slope leading up to it. So you're pushing everything from like 1.5K to maybe even 6 kilohertz there, and then a pretty big lift again before it starts dropping off somewhere between 15 to 20 kilohertz. This is one of the aspects that sometimes can be the most controversial about these AUDIX mics. Some people love the fact that they're incredibly pre-shaped right out of the box. Some people get a little frustrated with that because obviously you end up with a pretty big dip, which can sound a little bit unnatural, can sound a little bit, excessively scooped or pre-EQ'd. But for me, especially when you're working with genres that like to crank their snares really high, when you get that really kind of pingy, ringy mid-range, and maybe not necessarily a ton of fundamental low frequency, this would be a microphone that I'd put up to try and minimize a little bit of that ringy mid-range and give it a little bit more oomph and a little bit more snap. Again, this is the whole point here. We're looking at how to use these frequency responses to get the sound that you want. Okay, let's have a listen to the AUDIX i5 now. Yeah, so right off the bat, we got a ton of depth in that fundamental range there. There's a ton of highs as well. You can hear the wires are coming through a lot more on the i5 than some of these other microphones, which may or may not be what you want. But again, when I want a snare that's going to immediately come through as kind of larger than life and already sound exciting, then this is definitely what I want as well. I think next up, we have the MIKTEK PM10. This is also probably one of the more modern sounding mics in this little collection. Slightly chunkier sized microphone here. Put them up end to end here. And you see how much bigger the capsule is on the MIKTEK versus the SM57. This microphone is very much in the opposite direction of the AUDIX i5, where I find that it really accentuates a lot of that mid-range frequency that can also be really handy when, as I was mentioning, some of those genres or even drumming styles where the drummers really like to crank their snares up high and get a lot of that sort of pingy mid-range. If you want to accentuate that rather than reduce it, this is definitely the microphone to choose for that task. Because, yeah, having a look at the frequency response for the PM10, while on some of these other microphones, the low end kind of looks like it already has a high-pass filter built in. Instead, we've got a dip centered somewhere right around 45 to 50 hertz here. Then everything kind of hypes back up between 100 to 200. We've actually got a bit more of a lift here. You can see it's a couple dBs lifted right around 300 to 500 hertz. And that tends to be where some of those ringy overtones of a snare drum live. So when you're wanting a little extra of that ping, a little bit more of that kind of natural excitement to your snare drum, this microphone is going to push that forward rather than ducking it back the way that the i5 does. Rather than being bumpy or spiky like some of these other ones, you can see right from about 100 hertz to 2 kilohertz, everything is pushed up at least a dB or two above the zero line. So all of your mid-range is going to be kind of pushed a little bit forward. And then we've got a fairly natural but not entirely smooth accentuation in the presence range again. We got a few peaks and dips here, a little bit of a duck down around 7-8K, and then got a couple little peaks again before things drop off heading towards that 20 kilohertz range. Again, it's a little bit more accentuated than, say, an SM57 or some of these other options, but if you want to add a little extra thrill to your snare drum sound, this can be a great choice for that. So, talking about it is one thing. Let's actually hear it. Let's take a listen. Pay attention to the mid-range as we have a listen to the MIKTEK PM10 here. As you can hear, yeah, there's a lot more of that upper harmonic content going on in the mid-range there, while This snare drum is not tuned particularly high. There isn't a ton of that kind of ping-ping going on. You'll be able to tell when we do a head-to-head shootout here in a moment just how much more that mid-range comes forward when using the MIKTEK rather than, say, using the AUDIX i5. Next up, we have what I would say is possibly the most overlooked and underappreciated microphone in this group here. I'd imagine a lot of people are probably not even particularly familiar with. This is an AUDIO-TECHNICA. This is from their ATM line, and this is the ATM21. It's a microphone that kind of comes with some of its own complications when using it. If you can see just how much bigger this mic is than an SM57, it can make it a little bit hard to place, but unlike the last couple mics we looked at, the MIKTEK and the AUDIX, this one for me is all about vibe when I want to pick up something in a much more natural manner. And we'll take a look at the frequency response for this microphone, and you'll see what I mean when I say that it's my choice for when I want something a little bit more natural. Now, admittedly, I had quite a bit of trouble actually finding a response chart for this mic, given that it's been out of production for a while. There's not a lot of information available about it on the internet, but I did manage to pull up a bit of a response chart for it here based off of tracking down an eBay listing that took a picture of the box and cropping out this part. You can see, like the 57, it's got a pretty significant roll-off once you get down around 100 hertz, even maybe up as high as 150, 160. Pretty flat through the low mid-range, a little bit of a dip, about 550, 600 hertz. Pretty flat again through the upper mid-range, around 1 to 2K, and then we start getting a bit of a gentle lift here, centered significantly lower than the 5K bump that you see on the 57 or the i5. Comes back down, a little bit of a dip again above 5-6 kilohertz. Maybe a slight bump again around 7 kilohertz, flattens out, and then one more lift actually higher probably than any of the other microphones on this list. Up above 10K, there's actually a little bit of a lift up as well, which makes this microphone all in all sound very linear, despite what you hopefully can see on the screen here in terms of where its dips and valleys are. Let's have a little listen to the AUDIO-TECHNICA ATM21. Okay, last but not least, this is my AKG D40. Unlike the last one we just looked at, this is a much smaller body on this microphone. This is from one of their drum mic kits as well. This is specifically designed to be used on drums and percussion, particularly in the live environment. But this is also a microphone I've had for a really long time. This is one of my first purchases when I was looking for SM57 alternatives. Whereas the 57 makes everything sound a little bit dry, this microphone, because it's got a little bit more of an accentuated frequency response as well, tends to hype things up a little bit better. Let's pull up the response chart here. Yeah, so you can see there's quite a bit of non-linearity going on in the response of this microphone. Again, we've got a little bit of a lift going on between 100 to 200 hertz, centered a little bit lower than some of these other mics, where I think the AUDIX and the MIKTEK had a little bit more of their push going on up to and past 200. This microphone, since I think it was originally more designed for tom miking, has got its main low frequency push going on between 100 and 200, centered at about what looks to be 140 or 150. A little bit of a dip, but not anywhere near as significant as the AUDIX dip going on in the mid-range. Actually, a little bit of a spike again up around 500-600 hertz, which may be an area that you would want to address a little bit better with some EQ afterwards. 500-600 I find can get pretty ugly sometimes on a snare drum, but depending as well, maybe how the snare is tuned or what kind of performance you got going on, that might be an area where you want to keep some natural mid-range too. So definitely a call you have to make when mixing. Again, a little bit of a kind of a wavy push going on in the upper mid-range presence sort of region. around 1, 2, and then maybe about 3.5 to 4K. You got a couple big bumps. We got a little bit of a dip again, going back towards the 5, 6K range, and then kind of a gentle lift again, centered right around 10K. As we will hear in the sample in just a moment, for my ears and my estimation, this is actually probably the most immediately bright sounding microphone out of all of these selections. This would be a mic that I choose a lot of the time if I'm knowing that this microphone will naturally push all that high end and presence up. Is gonna come in handy if you got a particularly dark or dull sounding source. Let's have a listen now to the last mic in this little shootout. This is the AKG D40. Here we go. Yeah, so immediately, as you can hear, very bright, very kind of aggressive, maybe even getting a little bit abrasive, I'd say, in the highs and high mids. But again, if you got a particularly dark source and you want to give it a little bit more excitement, this might be exactly what you're looking for. And as well, a little bit fuller, not anywhere near as like hyped up in the bottom as, say, the AUDIX or the MIKTEK, but still just got a little bit more weight to it than a 57 as well. I think I've talked enough about all of this. If you're still not quite getting the difference between all of these, if it's still not quite sticking out to you, I think now we'll just do a little bit of a straight head-to-head comparison of all 6 of these microphones. Pay attention to the way that the frequency response changes as we cycle through these mics. Listen to how much bass response there is, listen to where the mid-range is sitting, listen to where as well that presence bump that each of these microphones has sits, listen to how that affects the attack and the articulation of the snare drum. Here we go, head to head, let's check it out. Okay, so there we go. Hopefully that is more than enough time spent giving you guys a good look at exactly how much you can do when it comes to shaping your sources by selecting the right microphone. The point of this video is not at all to try and say that the SM57 is a bad mic. I own a few of them for a reason, but again, having a good selection of microphones that do things a little bit differently, and having the knowledge of how each one of these microphones responds, so that when you're hearing the source in the room, when you're deciding on your mic selection and your placement for whatever you're trying to record, you know that it's going to start you off at the closest point to your intended finish line, and hopefully require a little bit less work in the post-production side to make it sit exactly where you want. I think that'll pretty much wrap it up for us here for today. Let me know what you guys think of this little shootout. Let me know which microphones you liked, maybe if there were any that you didn't like. Let me know if you think that you could even hear much of a difference. Maybe you're sitting there kind of scratching your head and going, they all sound the same to me. Either way, love to hear what you guys think down in the comments. And I guess while you're down there, maybe think about doing that whole like and subscribe sort of thing that I'm apparently terrible at remembering to mention in these videos. So if you feel like it, go for it. We're not done with this whole microphone exploration either. I think I'm going to try and run a similar comparison like this on one of the other most common uses for dynamic microphones in the studio, which of course would be miking up a heavy electric guitar speaker. So keep an eye out for that video coming in the next little while as well. If you have any questions about these microphones, about the setup, if there's anything that you think that I didn't explain well enough, by all means, let me know in the comments as well. Thanks again for tuning in, checking this out. And until next time, stay safe out there. Keep making noise. Take care, guys.